Victor Halstead walked into that courtroom like a man who had already won. Tailored suit, top lawyers, and a judge in his pocket back in Bisbee. He looked at Evelyn, the mother who had crawled through the Arizona desert to keep her daughter safe, and said it plainly, "You are not fit to raise that child." Then he looked at Clara, 4 years old, clutching a broken stick she'd used to guard her unconscious mother alone for a day and a night. And he didn't say her name. Not once. To him, she wasn't a little girl. She was property filed in the wrong place. What he didn't count on was the solitary rancher who pulled them out of that desert and then refused to let go. If this story moved you, hit like, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning Wyatt Calder found them, he almost didn't stop. He'd been riding the eastern edge of his property since before sunup, checking fence line the way he checked it every Tuesday. Not because he expected to find anything wrong, but because it gave his hands something to do and his head something to follow that wasn't memory. The desert in early June was already brutal by 7 in the morning. The kind of heat that didn't build gradually but arrived all at once, like a door being thrown open into a furnace room. He'd been sweating through his shirt for an hour, squinting against the white glare of the sky, when he heard it. He pulled the horse up short. The sound came again, thin, high, and desperate, somewhere off to his left where the scrub brush thickened near a dry wash. His first thought was an animal, a coyote pup separated from its mother, maybe. He'd found those before, but there was something in the pitch of it, something rhythmic and exhausted rather than wild, that made him turn the horse without quite deciding to. He pushed through 40 yards of mesquite and ocotillo before he saw her. She was 4 years old, maybe. Small, even for 4. The kind of small that made her look like she'd been carved down by hard weather rather than just being naturally little. She was standing over a woman lying flat in the dirt, and she was holding a stick. Not a branch. A stick. Maybe 18 inches long, dry and cracked, halfway down its length. The kind of thing that would snap if you looked at it wrong. She was holding it in both hands in front of her chest, and she was staring directly at Wyatt with eyes that were red from crying and cracked at the corners from dehydration, and she did not move. The woman on the ground wasn't moving either. "Hey," Wyatt said. He didn't dismount yet. He'd learned a long time ago that sudden movements around frightened things, human or otherwise, rarely helped. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you." The girl said nothing. She adjusted her grip on the stick. He noticed then that her lips were split, that her dress, once probably blue, now bleached nearly white by sun and stained with red Arizona dirt, was torn at the shoulder, that her feet were bare and cut, that she'd been standing here, in this heat, holding that useless stick between herself and whatever the world was going to send at her next, for what looked like a very long time. "Is that your mama?" he asked. Still nothing. But her eyes flicked down to the woman for just a fraction of a second, involuntary, and then came back to him. "Okay," he said. He swung down from the saddle slowly, keeping his hands visible, the way he used to move around men who'd been in the field too long and couldn't always tell friend from threat anymore. "I'm going to check on her. I'm not going to touch you. You can keep holding that stick." He crouched beside the woman and put 2 fingers to her throat. Pulse. There, but thin, shallow. Her skin was burning up and dry as paper. No sweat, which was bad. She'd been past the point of sweating for hours. Her breathing was so shallow he had to watch her chest for a full 10 seconds before he was sure he was seeing it move. She was alive. For now. But not by much. He looked up. The girl was watching him with the focused, terrible attention of someone who had been alone with this for a long time and had already run through every option available to her and found them all useless. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd moved past crying into something quieter and more frightening, the flat, waiting stillness of a child who has decided that whatever happens next, she is going to face it standing up. "How long has she been like this?" Wyatt asked. The girl swallowed. Her throat moved with visible effort. Then, very quietly, "Since yesterday." He stood up. He looked at the woman, then at the girl, then at the horse, then at the sky, calculating. His ranch house was 1.25 miles to the northwest. He had water in his saddlebag. 2 canteens, both about 3/4 full. He had a bedroll strapped behind the saddle. He had nothing resembling medical supplies, but he had more at the house. "What's your name?" he asked the girl. She considered not answering. He could see her considering it. "Clara," she finally said. "Clara. I'm Wyatt. I live about a mile that way." He nodded northwest. "I'm going to pick your mama up and put her on my horse and take her somewhere she can get water and get out of the sun. I need you to walk with me." Clara looked at the horse. She looked at her mother. She looked at Wyatt with those cracked, exhausted, ferociously alert eyes. "You'll carry her? Yes? The whole way?" "The whole way." She thought about this. Then she took one step to the side, not back, not retreating, just repositioning, so that she was no longer directly between Wyatt and her mother. It wasn't trust, exactly. It was more like a provisional suspension of hostility. She kept the stick. He didn't comment on it. Getting Evelyn Voss onto the horse was harder than he'd expected. She wasn't a large woman, but dead weight was dead weight, and the footing was bad on the uneven ground, and she made no sound at all when he lifted her, which bothered him more than if she'd cried out. He settled her across the saddle as carefully as he could manage, keeping one hand against her back to hold her in place, and then he looked at Clara. "Can you keep up?" he asked. "On foot?" "I've been keeping up," she said, and the flatness in her voice was not childish defiance. It was just a statement of fact from someone who had already proven the thing she was being asked about. He handed her one of the canteens. She drank from it in careful, measured sips, not gulping, not panicking, with the discipline of someone who had learned recently and the hard way that drinking too much too fast made you sick. Then she handed it back. "Keep it," he said. "Drink more when you feel like it." She held the canteen in one hand and the broken stick in the other, and she walked beside him in the brutal morning heat without complaint. He didn't ask her what had happened, not yet. You didn't push people, children or adults, when they were still in the middle of the thing. You got them safe first. You got them fed and watered and rested. The story came out on its own, in pieces, when the body wasn't still fighting to survive. He did notice the bruising on her mother's arms, old bruises, yellowed at the edges, and newer ones. He noticed the way the woman's right wrist was swollen and bent at an angle that was not natural. He noticed the dried blood at her hairline on the left side, mostly hidden by her hair, and the careful way Clara kept glancing up at her mother's face as they walked, checking, the way a person checks something they are terrified of losing. He noticed all of this and said nothing. When they reached the ranch house, he got Evelyn down from the horse and carried her inside and put her on the bed in the back room, the one he never used, the one that had been his sister's when they were young and that he'd never managed to repurpose into anything useful. He laid her down on the quilt his mother had made, which was faded now and worn thin in places, and he pulled her into the shade of the room and went to get water. Clara came inside without being invited. She stood in the doorway of the back room watching while he got Evelyn onto her side, in case she vomited, and started working water into her, a little at a time, using a cloth to wet her lips first, and then trying to get her to swallow. It was slow, grinding work, the kind that required patience over skill, and Wyatt had never been a patient man by nature. He'd had to learn it the way he'd learned most things, by being forced to. "Is she going to die?" Clara asked from the doorway. He didn't look up. "Not if I can help it." "People say that," Clara said, "and then they die anyway." He looked up then. She was standing there in the doorway with her stick and her canteen and her torn dress, and her face was very still, and she was watching him with those eyes that had seen too much already for a 4-year-old. He didn't tell her everything was going to be fine. He didn't say, "Don't worry," or "Of course not," or "She'll be okay, sweetheart," in the automatic, reassuring voice adults used when they wanted children to stop asking difficult questions. "You're right," he said. "Sometimes they do. But she's breathing, and her heart is beating, and I'm not done yet." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she came into the room and sat down on the floor beside the bed, cross-legged, stick across her knees, and she stayed there. He worked through the afternoon. Wyatt Calder had not intended to be a man who knew anything about medical care. He'd been a rancher's son, and then a soldier, and then a rancher again. Those three things, in that order, with not much space between them and nothing gentle in any of the transitions. The army had taught him things he'd never asked to know: how to treat a wound in the field when there was no doctor available, how to bring someone back from heat stroke when you had nothing but shade and water and time, how to watch a man's breathing and know from the rhythm whether things were getting better or worse. He'd learned all of it in the worst possible classroom, with the worst possible cost for getting it wrong. He'd never been grateful for any of it until now. He got 2 more canteens from the well house and soaked a cloth and laid it across the back of Evelyn's neck. He got the swelling in her wrist wrapped with strips of an old flannel shirt he found in the trunk at the foot of the bed. He cleaned the cut at her hairline, which was less bad than it had looked. Head wounds bled dramatically, but this one was shallow, and the blood had dried and wasn't weeping fresh. He checked her eyes when they fluttered half open once, briefly, and found the pupils even and responsive, which was something. Clara watched all of this from the floor without speaking. She drank from the canteen when she remembered to. At some point, she accepted the biscuit and dried meat Wyatt brought her from the kitchen without looking at it and ate it in small bites without tasting it, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. Around 4 in the afternoon, Evelyn's skin was still hot, but she'd started sweating again, which meant her body had enough water in it to regulate. Wyatt sat back against the wall and let out a long, slow breath and looked at the ceiling. "She's going to be okay," he said. Not reassurance this time. Statement of fact. Clara's grip on the stick loosened, just slightly. "Where did you learn to do all that?" she asked. "Army," he said. "Were you a doctor in the army?" "No, just a soldier who paid attention." Clara thought about this. "My papa was a soldier," she said. "He died. I'm sorry. It was before I was born. Mama says he was brave." She paused. "She says a lot of things about him. I don't know if they're all true." Wyatt didn't say anything. He'd learned that sometimes children needed to talk to someone who wasn't going to react emotionally to what they said, someone who would just receive the information without making it into something. "We were going to Tucson," Clara said. "Mama has a friend there. She said we could stay with her friend until we figured things out." She looked at the stick in her lap. "We ran out of water the first day. I don't think Mama knew it was so far." "It's a long way on foot," Wyatt said carefully. "We didn't have a horse." A pause. "We didn't have a lot of things." He didn't push for more. She'd given him the shape of it. A woman alone with a small child, running somewhere, not prepared, running out of everything faster than she'd planned. The bruises on Evelyn's arms told him something about why she might be running. The fractured wrist told him more. Outside, the desert was beginning to cool into the long bronze light of late afternoon. Wyatt's ranch sat 12 miles from the nearest town, which was a small, rough place called Cutter's Creek that had a general store, a post office, a saloon, and a livery stable, and not much else. He'd chosen the distance deliberately when he'd come back from the war and bought the property. He'd wanted to be a long way from things. From people, mostly. He wasn't sure, sitting on the floor of his spare room, watching a 4-year-old guard her mother with a broken stick, whether that choice had been wisdom or cowardice. He'd told himself for years it was wisdom. Lately, he wasn't so certain. Evelyn Voss opened her eyes for the first time just after dark. She didn't open them dramatically, didn't gasp or lurch upright. She just came back slowly, like someone surfacing from deep water, and then she was there, looking at the ceiling, breathing, alive. Her first word was not a question or an exclamation. It was a name. "Clara." "I'm here, Mama." Clara was on her feet before Wyatt could move beside the bed, her hand finding her mother's. Evelyn turned her head and looked at her daughter, and something in her face did something complicated. Relief and guilt and love, all at once, tangled together in a way that didn't untangle easily. "You're okay," Evelyn said. "I found someone," Clara said. "He helped." Evelyn's eyes found Wyatt then. He was standing back near the doorway, deliberately making himself small, taking up as little space as possible because he understood that this moment was not his. Her eyes were dark brown, fever bright, and she looked at him with the careful, measuring look of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly and make decisions fast. "Where are we?" she asked. "My ranch," he said. "About 12 miles north of Cutter's Creek. You were in the wash east of here. You'd been down since yesterday, from what Clara told me." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were a little clearer. I remember the sun, she said. I remember thinking we needed to stop, and then I don't remember anything else. Your wrist is broken, he said. Your head's cut, but not bad. You were heat struck. You need water and rest, and probably a few days before you try to go anywhere. I can't stay, she said immediately, and started to push herself up. Clara put a hand on her shoulder, and she stopped. Not because she couldn't push through it, but because her daughter's hand on her shoulder seemed to anchor her in a way that nothing else did. A few days, Wyatt said. Then you can go wherever you need to go. Evelyn looked at him. He held the look, not challenging, not demanding anything. Why? She asked. It wasn't an ungrateful question. It was a legitimate one. She'd learned, apparently, that help always came with a price, and she wanted to know what the price was before she accepted more of it. Because your daughter walked a mile in that heat without complaining, Wyatt said, and she didn't leave your side for a single minute, and that's the kind of thing that deserves something decent in return. Evelyn's jaw moved. She looked at Clara. Clara was watching her with that same fierce, unblinking attention she'd turned on Wyatt in the wash, and Evelyn reached up with her good hand and touched her daughter's face, just briefly, and then she looked back at the ceiling and seemed to make some internal decision. A few days, she said quietly. Thank you. There's a kitchen, Wyatt said. I'll put something together. He left them to it, to the private reunion of a mother and daughter who had come very close to being separated permanently, and went to the kitchen and stood at the stove and stared at the pot in his hands for a full minute before remembering what he'd gone in there to do. He hadn't had anyone in this house in 3 years, not since the last time his nearest neighbor, a man named Garrett, who ran cattle 20 miles to the west, had stopped in on his way through to water his horses. Not since before that, really, in any meaningful way. The house had been quiet for so long that the sound of Clara's voice carrying from the back room, high and soft, telling her mother something he couldn't quite make out, felt almost physically strange, like a sound from a different lifetime. He made soup from what he had, which wasn't much, and brought it to them, and Evelyn ate it propped up against the headboard with Clara sitting beside her, and neither of them spoke much, and Wyatt stayed in the doorway for a few minutes and then said goodnight and went back to his own room. He lay awake for a long time. He was not a man who went looking for complications. He had built his life specifically to minimize them. The remote location, the deliberate solitude, the days that looked the same from one end to the other, because sameness was safe, and safe was something you valued when you'd spent enough time in places where nothing was safe at all. He had a routine, and he kept to it. He had a ranch, and he ran it. He had a particular quality of silence that he'd worked hard to construct, and that mostly, when it was working right, kept the other things out. The other things being the faces he still saw sometimes when he closed his eyes. The sounds he heard in the quiet moments of the wrong kind of night. The weight of decisions he'd made in places far from here, under different skies, with different and terrible consequences that had never quite settled into anything he could put down. He'd been in the war for 4 years. He'd come home and found that home was not a place he fit into anymore. And so he'd come here instead, to this patch of difficult country that asked nothing of him except work and endurance. And for 8 years he'd told himself that this was enough, that a man who'd done the things he'd done had no business wanting more than this. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence, which was not quite silence anymore, and thought about a 4-year-old girl with a broken stick and eyes that refused to give up. He was not sure what to do with any of it. He fell asleep eventually, which surprised him, and dreamed of nothing, which surprised him more. In the morning, Clara was in his kitchen. She'd found the eggs. He kept 6 hens in a small coop behind the house, and she'd brought in 4 of them, and she was standing at the stove with a cast-iron pan that was nearly as tall as she was, looking at the pan, and then looking at the eggs, and then looking at the stove with the focused, problem-solving expression of someone who knew in principle what she wanted to accomplish but was working out the mechanics in real time. Wyatt stopped in the kitchen doorway. "I was going to make eggs," Clara said, without looking at him. "Mama likes eggs." "She does?" "She used to make them every morning before." A pause. "Before things got bad." He almost asked what had made things bad and stopped himself. He crossed to the stove and crouched down so he was closer to her level. "You want help?" Clara considered the pan. "Do you know how to make them so they're soft? Not too hard? Mama doesn't like them when they're too hard." "I can manage that." "Okay." She handed him the pan with great seriousness, like she was delegating an important task to a qualified subordinate, and stepped back to supervise. He made the eggs, he made coffee, and found the last of a tin of condensed milk that he hadn't opened yet, which Clara declared acceptable for her mother with a gravity that almost made him smile. She carried the tray to the back room herself, carefully, both hands, the broken stick tucked under her arm because she was not yet ready to put it down. Later, when Evelyn was sleeping again, and Clara had come back to the kitchen and was sitting at the table drinking a cup of milk he'd watered down and sweetened with the end of a jar of honey, Wyatt sat across from her and looked at the stick she'd placed on the table between them. "You want to tell me about that?" he asked. Clara looked at it. "I found it when Mama fell down," she said. "I picked it up because I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know what I thought. I just thought I needed something. To protect her." "To try," Clara said. "I knew it probably wouldn't work. If something came, a coyote or a person, I knew it probably wouldn't be enough." She touched the crack in the middle of the stick, but I thought maybe if I held it, whatever came would have to get through me first. Wyatt looked at the stick. He looked at Clara. "That's a brave thing," he said. "Mama says I'm too little to be brave," Clara said. "She says brave is for grown-ups." "Your mama's wrong about that one," Wyatt said. Clara's eyes came up to his. She looked at him very carefully, the way she looked at everything, assessing, weighing, making some internal calculation he couldn't follow. Then she looked back at the stick. "Can I stay here?" she asked. "Until Mama's better?" "Yes," he said. "And after?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the table, then at the window, then at the stick with its cracked middle and its rough bark worn smooth in two places where small hands had gripped it for a very long time. "Let's see how your mama feels," he said. "When she can tell us herself." It was the most honest answer he had. Clara accepted it with a nod and finished her milk and picked up her stick and went back to check on her mother. And Wyatt sat alone at his kitchen table in the house that had been quiet for 3 years and felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, like the silence might not be the point after all. Evelyn's fever broke on the third morning. Not dramatically. No sudden gasp, no eyes flying open, no moment where everything shifted at once. It was quieter than that. Wyatt came in before dawn to check on her the way he'd been doing every few hours, and he put the back of his hand against her forehead, and the heat that had been living there for 2 days was just less. Still warm. But human warm, not the dry furnace heat that had worried him the first night when he'd sat in the chair beside the bed and watched her breathe and done the math on whether he needed to ride hard to Cutter's Creek for a doctor, and concluded that moving her would do more damage than staying put. He'd made the right call. He didn't feel good about it exactly. He never felt good about decisions made under pressure, even when they worked out. But he'd made it, and it had held. He went back to the kitchen and put the coffee on and stood at the window watching the sky go from black to the deep purple gray of pre-dawn. And he thought about what came next. They'd need to leave eventually. Evelyn had said she was going to Tucson, to a friend. The broken wrist would make travel hard for weeks, but that wasn't something he could solve for her. He could give them a few more days, maybe a week, get her strong enough to ride in a wagon. He could take them to Cutter's Creek himself, see them onto the stage line. That was the plan. Clean, finite. Something a reasonable man could execute without getting complicated. He was still working on convincing himself it was a good plan when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway in the oversized shirt he'd given her to sleep in. It came down past her knees. Carrying her stick and looking at him with the alert, slightly suspicious expression that was apparently just her natural resting face. "Mama's awake," she said. "She wants to talk to you." He found Evelyn sitting up in bed, which was the first time she'd managed it without help. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and her face was still pale, still drawn, but her eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been since he'd found her. She was looking at her bandaged wrist in her lap with an expression he couldn't quite read. somewhere between frustration and resignation, like she was taking an accounting of damages and didn't love the total. She looked up when he came in. "You reset this," she said. "The wrist?" "Had to," he said. "It was displaced. Leaving it would have meant you'd lose the use of it." She was quiet a moment. "That must have hurt." "You were unconscious, mostly." She didn't ask about the mostly. She looked at her wrist again, then at him. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "I don't have any way to repay it right now. And I want you to know I understand that's not a comfortable position to put a stranger in. You didn't put yourself there on purpose." "No, but I put Clara there." Her voice changed slightly on her daughter's name, tightened, then deliberately smoothed. "That's the part I can't—" She stopped, started again differently. "How long have we been here?" 3 days. She absorbed this. "She didn't leave, did she?" "Clara. She didn't leave my side." "Not much. Slept on the floor next to the bed the first 2 nights. Ate when I made her. Came to the kitchen a few hours here and there." He paused. "She made you eggs the second morning, or tried to. I helped." Something moved across Evelyn's face that she controlled quickly, pressing her lips together. When she spoke again, her voice was even. "She's 4 years old," she said. "She shouldn't be—" She stopped again. "She handled herself," Wyatt said. "Better than a lot of people I've known who were 3 times her age." Evelyn looked at him. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he said honestly. "I don't know what would." She looked at the window. The early light was coming in at a low angle, and for a moment her face was all shadow and pale gold, and he could see what the last several days, and probably the last several months, from the look of her, had cost her. The bruises on her arms were fading to yellow but still visible. The cut at her hairline had scabbed over cleanly. The wrist was wrapped and splinted with what he'd been able to put together from the materials on hand. "I need to ask you something," she said, still looking at the window. "Go ahead." She turned back to him. "Who knows we're here?" He hadn't expected that question. He looked at her steadily. "Nobody. I don't get many visitors. I haven't been to town since you arrived." She let out a slow breath that wasn't quite relief, more like someone setting down a weight they weren't sure they'd be able to pick back up. "Good," she said. "That's good. You want to tell me what we're keeping you hidden from?" The pause was long enough that he thought she'd decided not to answer. Then, "My husband's brother," she said. "His name is Victor Halstead. He's been—" She seemed to search for the right word and reject several before landing on one. "Persistent." About what?" She looked at her hands, at the bandaged wrist, the uninjured one resting in her lap. "About Clara," she said. Wyatt waited. "My husband died 14 months ago," Evelyn said. "Thomas. It wasn't a good marriage, but he was Clara's father, and he's gone, and what followed was—" She exhaled. "Victor decided that with Thomas gone, he had some claim, that Clara belonged with the Halstead family, that I was not capable." She said the last word with a flatness that carried a great deal of history inside it. "He has money. He has lawyers. He has a judge in Bisbee who owes him favors. I had a house that was in Thomas's name and a daughter and nowhere particularly safe to go." "So you ran?" "I planned to run," she said. "I planned better than I executed." A bitter edge in her voice directed inward. "I miscalculated the water badly. I thought we were closer to the next settlement than we were, and then my wrist—" She looked at it. "I fell. And after that it happened very fast." Wyatt thought about the dry wash, about Clara standing in the heat with her broken stick, alone with her unconscious mother for a full day and a night. "Victor Halstead," he said. "Out of Bisbee? Originally, he moves around. He has money in mining and land." She looked at him directly. "He will look for us. He's not the kind of man who accepts that something he wants has gone somewhere he can't reach it. He thinks of Clara as something he wants." "He thinks of Clara as a Halstead," Evelyn said, "which in his mind is the same thing. She's Thomas's daughter. Thomas had land, and Thomas had a family name that means something in certain circles, and Victor has no children of his own, and—" She stopped. "He told me once that I was a vessel, that I'd served my purpose, and the product of that purpose belonged to his family. The word vessel landed in the room with a particular weight. Wyatt didn't say anything for a moment. "He said that to you directly," he said. "He said it in front of two of his lawyers and a man who worked for him, and nobody in the room thought it was remarkable. She said it simply, without drama, which made it worse. That was the day I started planning." Wyatt stood up from the chair he'd pulled to the bedside and went to the window and looked out at the scrub and the long, flat distance. 12 miles to Cutter's Creek, maybe 150 to Tucson. The stage line ran 3 times a week if it ran on schedule, which it mostly didn't. "Does anyone know you were heading to Tucson?" he asked. "I didn't tell anyone, but Victor has resources. If he talks to the right people in Bisbee—" She didn't finish the sentence. "How long before he starts looking in earnest?" "He's probably already looking." She said it matter-of-factly. "He had someone watching my house. I left in the middle of the night. I had a 3 or 4 hour lead, at most." He turned from the window. She was watching him with that same careful, measuring look she'd given him the first night she'd been conscious, sizing him up, trying to determine what kind of man he was and what he was likely to do with the information she'd just handed him. "I'm not going to tell anyone you're here," he said. "I didn't think you were," she said, "but I wanted you to know what you're involved in. You didn't choose this." "No," he agreed, "but here we are." Claire appeared in the doorway, then with 2 cups of coffee. She'd apparently decided, sometime in the last 20 minutes, that she was capable of operating the coffee pot, and she'd produced something that looked approximately like coffee with an expression of tremendous satisfaction. "I made it," she announced. Evelyn looked at the cups. She looked at her daughter. Wyatt showed me yesterday." I remembered. Clara carried both cups to the bed with extreme care, not spilling, and set them on the small table beside it, and then she looked at Wyatt. "I made you one too. It's on the stove. I couldn't carry 3. He went and got his cup. It was strong enough to strip paint, which meant she'd been paying attention when he made it, because that was how he made it. He drank it without comment. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Wyatt hadn't planned on and couldn't quite explain. He had ranch work that needed doing, fence line to check, water troughs to clear, the sorry state of the south pasture gate that had been hanging wrong for 2 months and getting worse. And he did it, same as always, early morning until the heat drove him in. But the house was different now. There were sounds in it. Evelyn's voice from the back room, low and steady, reading to Clara from the one book they'd managed to keep through whatever they'd been through, a battered collection of fables that Clara apparently had most of memorized but wanted read aloud anyway. The sound of Clara in the kitchen, investigating cupboards, asking questions about everything she found with the methodical curiosity of someone who had decided to become an expert on this particular environment. On the 4th day, Evelyn made it to the kitchen under her own power for the first time. She sat at the table and drank her coffee left-handed because the right wrist was still splinted, and she watched Clara reorganize the shelf where Wyatt kept his tins, and she looked like a woman who was carrying something very heavy and had gotten used to the weight of it without getting comfortable with it. "She does that wherever we go," Evelyn said quietly, watching Clara rearrange the tins in order of size. "Organizes things, makes herself useful. She's been doing it since—" She paused. "Since the house. Since things got bad there." Wyatt was at the stove. He didn't turn around. "How long were things bad?" "Long enough." She wrapped both hands around her cup, left hand dominant. "Thomas he wasn't a violent man exactly, not the way some men are. But he had a temper, and he drank. And when he drank, the temper got worse, and—" She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "You don't have to." "No, She seemed to make a decision. "I want to, because you should understand that I didn't end up in that wash by accident. I mean, I made specific choices that led me there, and some of those choices were bad, and I'm not going to pretend they weren't. I stayed too long. I thought things would improve. I made excuses." She looked at her bandaged wrist. "Thomas didn't break this, if that's what you're wondering. I fell on it in the dark the first night we were walking, but the bruises on my arms are older than that." "I noticed," Wyatt said. "I thought you had." He turned from the stove and sat down at the table. Clara was still absorbed in her project on the shelf, moving tins with focused concentration, and he lowered his voice slightly. "You don't owe me any explanation," he said. You don't owe me anything about your past. But if Halstead is going to come looking, I need to know what he's likely to do when he finds you. What kind of man is he besides rich? Evelyn thought about it. He's the kind of man who wins, she said. Not always because he's right. Because he's patient and he has money and he knows how to use both. He doesn't lose his temper. He makes plans. She looked at Wyatt steadily. He had me served with papers 2 weeks before I left. Legal documents claiming I was an unfit mother and seeking to establish guardianship of Clara on behalf of the Halstead family. The judge in Bisbee had already signed off on a preliminary order. I had a week before a hearing. So there's a legal process already started. There was. I ran before the hearing. She said it plainly. Which does not make me look better in the eyes of the law. I understand that. No, Wyatt agreed. It doesn't. But I wasn't going to sit in that courtroom with a judge who owed Victor Halstead money and a set of lawyers I couldn't afford and watch them hand my daughter to a man who has never once— Her voice stayed level, but the muscle in her jaw tightened. He has never once asked Clara what she wanted. He has never once spoken to her as though she were a person rather than a piece of property being incorrectly located. Clara turned from the shelf. "Mama," she said, "who are you talking about?" "No one important," Evelyn said, and her voice was perfectly even. Clara looked at her mother with the look of a child who was not fooled. Then she turned back to her tins. That evening, after Clara had fallen asleep on the narrow cot Wyatt had moved into the back room, she'd accepted the cot after 4 nights on the floor, which she appeared to regard as a concession rather than a comfort. Evelyn came and sat on the porch. Wyatt was already there. He sat on the steps most evenings and watched the sky go dark over the desert, which was a thing the desert did better than anywhere else he'd been. The colors coming down through purple and red and orange, and finally the particular deep blue that hung for 20 minutes before full dark, like the sky was deciding whether to finish. Evelyn sat in the chair he kept against the wall and didn't speak for a while, and he didn't either. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "You can ask." "Why are you alone out here?" He looked at the darkening sky. "That's a big question. You don't have to answer it." "No, He shifted on the step. "I came back from the war and didn't know how to be around people anymore. Not the way I had been before. And instead of figuring it out, He gestured at the landscape around them. "Came out here. It was easier." "Easier than what?" "Than being around people who expected me to be who I was before I left." He paused. "I wasn't that anymore. But I didn't know how to explain that without explaining everything, and I didn't want to explain everything, so I just—" He looked at his hands. "Stopped trying." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" It was the kind of question he'd have brushed off a week ago with something short and dismissive. He wasn't sure why he didn't now. "Some days," he said. "Not always." She looked at the sky. "I regret staying too long," she said. "I knew it wasn't right long before I admitted it. I kept thinking it was my fault, that if I did things differently, was different, it would fix itself." She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "It doesn't fix itself. You have to fix it. And I waited too long to start." "You got out," he said. "Nearly killed us in the process." "But you got out." She looked at him sideways. Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a window being cracked to test the air. "You're not very good at comforting people," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you're honest." "I try to be." "Thomas wasn't honest," she said. "He was charming. There's a difference." She looked back at the sky. "I spent a long time confusing the two." They sat in silence for a while after that. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that happened when 2 people had said what needed saying and were just resting in it. The stars were coming out, first 1, and then a dozen, and then too many to track, the way they came out here with no town lights to compete with. Just the sky and the desert and the particular desert quiet that was not really quiet at all, but full of small sounds if you knew how to listen. "I need to write to my friend in Tucson," Evelyn said. "Let her know I'm delayed. She'll be worried. There's paper and ink in the desk in the main room. I can take it to Cutter's Creek when I go for supplies next week." "Thank you." A pause. And I need to think about what I'm going to do. About Victor. About the hearing. Running isn't a long-term solution, I know that. No, he said, it isn't. But I don't know what the alternative is. She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of the problem. I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have family who could help. My friend in Tucson is kind, but she's not. She doesn't have resources either. She picked at the thread again. Victor does. Victor has all the resources. Wyatt didn't say anything because he didn't have a solution to offer, and he wasn't going to pretend he did. It was not until 2 days later that the shape of what was coming began to clarify itself. He'd ridden to the eastern fence line in the morning, the regular Tuesday check, and on his way back he'd swung south toward the road that connected Cutter's Creek to the mining settlements further down. He didn't have a particular reason for going that way. Something in the way Evelyn had talked about Halstead, patient, methodical, someone who made plans and waited them out, had been sitting in the back of his head, and he'd learned a long time ago to pay attention when the back of his head was trying to tell him something. He saw the dust about 2 miles south, 2 riders moving north on the road, moving unhurried, the pace of men who weren't lost and weren't in a rush and knew where they were going. He watched them from a rise for a few minutes until they were close enough for him to make out details. Both well-dressed for the territory, both riding good horses, both scanning the land on either side of the road in the particular way of men who were looking for something specific. He didn't recognize them, but he recognized the type. He rode back to the ranch at a pace that was quick without being panicked, and he came in through the back and found Evelyn in the kitchen with Clara, teaching her to knead dough with one good hand and a great deal of creative improvisation, and he stood in the doorway for a second and looked at the two of them. Evelyn's face flushed from the effort, Clara with flour on her nose, both of them involved in the project, and he said quietly and without preamble, 2 riders on the south road, coming this way. I don't know them. Evelyn went still. She didn't panic, she just went very still, and her eyes met his, and something passed through them that was not fear exactly, but its close relative. Clara, she said, same even voice she used for everything. Go get your stick and go to the back room and stay there until I come get you. Clara read her mother's face the way she always did, with that frightening accuracy that children developed when they'd spent enough time around adults whose emotions needed to be tracked for safety. And she wiped her hands on her dress and picked up her stick and went without argument. Evelyn looked at Wyatt. What did they look like? He described them. She listened without interrupting. I don't know if it's Victor's men, she said. He has people he uses. I've never met them. He wouldn't come himself, not first. He'd send someone to locate us and report back. She paused. Confirm we're here. So if we let them see you, he'll know where we are within a week, and he'll come with lawyers and an order from that judge, and... She stopped. I can't be found here. Clara can't. He thought about the 2 riders on the road, moving slow, looking at the land. There's a root cellar under the kitchen, he said. Trapdoor behind the stove. It's not comfortable, but it's dry. You can hear everything from down there. She looked at the floor. She looked at him. You want us to hide? Just until I know who they are, he said. If they ride past, you come back up and we forget about it. If they stop, he shrugged. I talk to them. And say what? That I live here alone, he said, which was true until 10 days ago and isn't the kind of lie I'll have trouble telling. Something moved across her face. Not offense exactly. The look of a woman who had not expected the man in front of her to be the kind of man who would tell a lie on her behalf, and wasn't quite sure what to do with that. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. She held his look for a moment. Then she called to Clara, and they went under the floor. He moved the stove back over the trap door. It wasn't a perfect concealment, but it was good enough for a casual look. And then he went and sat on the porch and waited. They came up the road 20 minutes later and turned in at his gate the way he'd expected they would, because he was the nearest ranch, and anyone looking for a woman and a child would stop at the nearest ranch and ask. They were polite. That was the first thing, the kind of politeness that came with money and instruction rather than manners. Smooth, surface level, with no warmth behind it. The older one did the talking, said they were looking for a woman named Evelyn Voss, traveling with a small child. Said it was a family matter. Said they had reason to believe she might have come through this area. Wyatt looked at them from the porch, with the particular expression he'd learned in the war for exactly this kind of situation. The one that was not unfriendly but revealed nothing, like a closed door that happened to have a man standing in front of it. "I've been out here on my own for 8 years," he said. "I don't see a great deal of passing traffic." "She would have come through maybe 10, 12 days ago," the man said. "On foot, possibly, with a small girl." "On foot," Wyatt said. "Yes, sir." He shook his head slowly. "If a woman and a child were walking through this desert on foot 12 days ago," he said, "and I'd seen them, I'd have stopped them. No one walks through here in June on foot. It's not survivable." The man looked at him. He looked back. It was the kind of exchange that had a lot of information in it and no words, and what Wyatt was conveying was, "I am a man who has nothing to hide and considerable experience with people who do, and you are not going to find anything useful here." After a moment, the man touched his hat, said they were sorry to bother, said if he saw anything to contact the Halstead Company office in Bisbee. They rode back out the gate and south on the road, and he watched them until the dust settled. Then he went inside and moved the stove and opened the trap door. Clara came up first, stick in hand, eyes bright with the controlled intensity of someone who had been very quiet for a very long time and found it difficult. Evelyn came up after her, and she stood in the kitchen with flour still on her hands from the bread dough and looked at Wyatt, and she said nothing for a long moment. "They're gone?" she said. "For now." "For now," she repeated. She looked at the trapdoor he was closing, at the stove, at her hands. "This isn't sustainable," she said quietly. "You know that." "I know," he said. "I can't keep hiding in your root cellar every time." "I know," he said again. "I'm thinking about it." She looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" He wasn't sure yet what it meant. He had the beginning of something in his head, rough and not fully formed, the kind of idea that needed a day or two to become a plan. He'd learned not to say things out loud until they were solid enough to hold weight. "It means I'm thinking about it," he said. "Give me a couple of days." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Clara, who was watching them both with her stick held loosely and her face very still. Then Evelyn turned back to the counter and picked up where she'd left off with the bread dough, because apparently even when things were falling apart, she intended to finish what she'd started, and Wyatt thought that was probably the most revealing thing he'd learned about her yet. He went back outside and stood on the porch in the heat and looked at the road, empty now, the dust long settled, and he turned the rough shape of the idea over in his head and looked at it from different angles and waited to see if it would hold. It was not a comfortable idea. But then, nothing worth doing out here ever was. He gave himself 2 days, the way he'd said he would. He didn't talk about it. He went about his work, the gate, the fence line, the water troughs, and he let the idea sit in the back of his head the way he'd learned to let things sit when they needed time to become solid. He'd made enough bad decisions in his life by moving too fast, saying things before they were ready, acting before he'd thought through the second and third consequences. The war had been full of that. Men who moved fast and paid for it in ways that couldn't be undone. So he worked, and he thought, and he watched. What he watched, mostly, was Clara. He watched her follow Evelyn around the kitchen with the specific devotion of a child who had decided that proximity was safety, staying close but not clinging. There was a dignity to it that struck him every time he noticed it. He watched her carry the stick less constantly now, setting it against the wall when she sat down to eat, picking it back up afterward, the way another child might carry a stuffed animal. He watched her ask questions about everything. The hens, the well, the way the pump handle worked, why the south pasture gate hung crooked, what the dark line on the horizon to the west was. He watched her file away every answer with a seriousness that went beyond childish curiosity into something that looked more like preparation. She was preparing for the world, a world she'd already learned would not prepare a space for her if she didn't carve one out herself. On the second evening, he was fixing the hinge on the coupe door when she came and stood beside him and watched, without speaking for a while. "It wobbles," she said. "The hinge is worn out," he said. "I've got a new one, just haven't gotten to it." "Why not?" "Had other things going on." She considered this. "Because of us?" "Partly." He kept working. "Doesn't matter. It needed doing anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then, Are you going to make us leave? He stopped, looked at her. She was watching the hinge, not him, her hands folded in front of her and the stick leaning against the fence post beside her. What makes you ask that? Mama thinks you might, Claire said. She doesn't say so, but I can tell she's thinking it. She looked at him then. Those men on the road. They were looking for us. He didn't insult her by pretending otherwise. Yes. Are more going to come? Probably. She absorbed this without visible distress, which told him she'd already worked through it on her own and arrived at the same conclusion. So what are you going to do? She asked. It was the same question Evelyn had asked him 2 days ago, and he was closer to an answer now than he'd been then, but he wasn't going to discuss it with a 4-year-old before he discussed it with her mother. I'm working on it, he said. Clara looked at him for a long moment, with those eyes that weighed things. Then she picked up the stick and went back inside, and he went back to the hinge, and by the time the light was gone, he'd fixed it properly, and he knew what he was going to say. He found Evelyn on the porch after Clara was asleep. She'd taken to coming out there in the evenings, the way he did, sitting in the chair against the wall. Her wrist was still splinted, but she'd stopped holding it like it was fragile. She held her coffee cup in her left hand and looked at the sky the way a person looked at something that wasn't going to give them any answers, but was at least honest about it. He sat on the steps. I've been thinking, he said. I know, she said. You've been thinking so hard for 2 days I could practically hear it from across the house. He almost smiled. Almost. Victor Halstead sends men to confirm you're here, and then he comes himself. With a court order and lawyers and whatever judge he's got arranged. And when he gets here, you have nothing. No money, no counsel, no legal standing. You ran from a hearing, which looks like you're hiding something, even if you were hiding from something. He takes Clara. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She said nothing. The only way to change that, Wyatt said, is to give you legal standing before he arrives. He paused. And to give Clara a father who has a name and a deed and 12 years of continuous property ownership in this territory that nobody can argue with. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Not empty, full, actually, dense with the weight of what he'd just said, which both of them were processing at different speeds and from different angles. Evelyn set her coffee cup down on the porch rail very carefully. What exactly are you saying? She said. I'm saying that if you were married to me, Wyatt said, keeping his voice even and his eyes on the desert, and if I had legally adopted Clara, then Victor Halstead's claim falls apart. He's claiming the child has no fit family. But if she has a father, one with land and standing and no debts, that argument disappears. Another silence, longer this time. That is, Evelyn stopped, tried again. Wyatt, we've known each other for 12 days. I know that. You're suggesting a practical arrangement, he said. He turned and looked at her directly. I'm not saying anything other than what it is. You need legal protection. I have the means to provide it. That's the whole of it. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at things she wasn't sure of, that careful, thorough look that had nothing soft in it. You've thought about what this would cost you, she said. It wasn't a question. I have. It's not nothing. Taking on a woman and a child you don't know. Getting involved in a legal fight with a man who has money and influence. I've been in worse fights, he said, with less at stake. The at stake part is exactly what I'm concerned about, she said. For you. I'm not in a position to weigh your welfare appropriately right now because I'm too desperate, and desperate people make bad bargains for everyone involved. That was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. He sat with it. You're not making a bargain, he said. I'm making an offer. You can say no. And if I say no, then we figure out something else. She picked up her cup again, held it in both hands, left and the splinted right, and looked at the night sky. He waited. He was not going to rush this. It was too large a thing to rush. Clara would have to agree, Evelyn said finally. Of course. Not just agree. Actually want it. She's 4, not a piece of furniture. She paused. If she doesn't take to you, truly, not just because she's learning not to be afraid of you, then I won't do it regardless of the legal situation. That's fair, he said. She was quiet for a long time. He could hear the desert doing its nighttime inventory of sounds. The wind low in the scrub, something small moving in the dry grass near the fence, the faint creak of the coop. "I had a marriage already," she said finally. "I know what it looks like from the inside when it isn't right." "This wouldn't be that," he said. "How would you know? You've known me 12 days. "Because I'm not Thomas," he said. "And I'm not Victor Halstead. And this isn't about ownership." She looked at him. He held the look. "No," she said slowly. "I don't think it is." She exhaled. "I need to sleep on it." "Take all the time you need," he said. "But not more than 2 or 3 days. If Halstead's men reported back to him already, he's making his own plans." She nodded. She picked up her cup and went inside. He sat on the steps for another hour, looking at the stars, feeling the weight of what he'd just proposed settle into his bones. He was not sure it was the right thing. He was not sure it wasn't. What he was sure of was that there was a child asleep in his spare room who had held a broken stick in the heat of an Arizona desert for a day and a night and not moved, and that child deserved better than what Victor Halstead was offering, and that sometimes you did a thing not because you were certain it was right, but because you were certain you could not do nothing. He'd made peace with worse reasoning in his life. Evelyn came to him the next morning before Clara was awake, while he was at the stove, and she said yes. She said it plainly, looking at him directly, with none of the hesitation of the night before. She'd slept on it and decided, and she was the kind of person who, once decided, didn't revisit. He recognized that quality. He had it himself. "Clara first," she said, "before anything else. She talks to you." He nodded. Clara took it better than either of them expected, and worse, and the way it actually went was nothing like what he'd imagined. He sat with her on the porch steps while Evelyn stayed inside, and he thought about how to explain it, and then decided that explaining it like it was complicated would make it complicated, so he just said it. "Your mom and I are thinking about getting married," he said. It would make me your father, legally, on paper, and it would help keep you safe from the man who's been trying to take you away." Clara looked at the stick in her lap. She looked at the horizon. She looked at her feet. "Would you be my father just on paper?" she asked. "Or for real?" He had not expected that particular question, precisely worded. He should have. It was Clara. He thought about the honest answer, which was that he didn't know, that he'd been alone for 8 years and hadn't thought about being anyone's father in longer than that. That he wasn't sure he was built for it or capable of it, and the very fact that she was asking him suggested she already sensed that uncertainty. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think that's something that happens over time, not something you decide in advance." Clara thought about this. "My papa was my father on paper," she said. "Mama says he loved me, but he wasn't there when I was born and he died before I could know him, so I don't really know what a father is." She paused. "Except what Mama says." "That's fair," he said. "You're different from how I thought you'd be," Clara said. "When I first saw you on the horse, I thought you were going to be mean." "I might have been," he said. "A few years ago." She looked at him sidelong. What changed? He didn't have a clean answer to that either. "I got tired of it," he said. "Being mean is work. It doesn't rest." Clara considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "Okay." "Okay what?" "Okay, you can marry Mama." She picked up the stick. "But if you're mean to her, I'll hit you with this." He looked at the stick. He looked at her. "That's fair," he said. 3 days later, he rode to Cutter's Creek and spoke to the justice of the peace, a spare, gray-faced man named Aldous Kern, who had been marrying and burying the people of this county for 30 years, and had the weathered look of someone who had seen the full range of human decisions and was not easily surprised by any of them. Wyatt explained the situation plainly. A woman he intended to marry, a child he intended to adopt, a legal filing that needed to happen quickly and correctly. He did not mention Victor Halstead by name. He didn't need to. Kern listened and asked 3 questions and said he could make it happen within the week. On the way back, he stopped at the general store and bought flour and sugar and a small bag of hard candy that Clara hadn't asked for, but that seemed like the kind of thing a person ought to bring back. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he got home, and she looked at the candy and then at him and said nothing, which was fine. Clara ate 3 pieces and saved the rest in a careful pile on the windowsill, organized by color. The marriage took place on a Thursday morning with Kern riding out to the ranch, because Evelyn's wrist was still healing and Wyatt hadn't wanted her to have to travel unnecessarily. Kern brought his ledger and a witness, a man from town named Dearborn, who was mostly deaf and seemed to regard the whole proceeding as unremarkable, which was probably a service to everyone involved. They stood in the main room of the ranch house because it was cool in there, and outside was already brutal by 9 in the morning, and Kern read the words and they said the necessary things, and it was done. Clara stood beside Evelyn and held her stick and watched the whole proceeding with the careful attention of someone who understood that a legal thing was happening and that legal things mattered. Afterward, Kern filed the adoption paperwork simultaneously, which he said was irregular but not unprecedented, and that he'd seen stranger things done under pressure and they generally held up if the intent was legitimate. Wyatt told him the intent was legitimate. Kern looked at Clara and then at Wyatt with the particular look of a man who had long since given up judging circumstances and just processed them, and he initialed the forms and said they'd be registered in the county records within the week. Dearborn shook everyone's hand and left. Kern had coffee and then left too. And then it was just the 3 of them, standing in the main room of a house that had been silent for 8 years, now carrying a legal weight it hadn't carried before, and none of them quite knew what to do with the next 5 minutes. Clara solved it by going to check on the hens. Evelyn stood by the window and didn't say anything for a moment, and Wyatt stood near the door and didn't either. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She turned from the window. There was something in her face that was not happiness exactly, and not relief exactly. More like the look of someone standing at the top of a very long climb, aware that the climb was over and not yet sure what the view was going to be. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that, not just the words." "I know," he said. She nodded once and went to the kitchen, because there was bread to finish, and the world was still making its demands, and Wyatt went outside to work because the south pasture needed him, and the afternoon was burning fast and some things didn't stop for legal proceedings or anything else. Victor Halstead arrived 11 days later. He didn't come with just his 2 men this time. He came with 4 riders, 2 of them carrying the polished, inexpressive look of professional lawyers rather than working men, and one of them carrying a leather satchel that rattled with documents. He came up the road in the afternoon heat with the composed, deliberate pace of a man who was certain of what he would find and certain of what he would do with it. Wyatt saw them from the east pasture and came back at a canter. He was on the porch when they rode in through the gate. He was alone on the porch because Evelyn and Clara were inside, which was where he'd asked them to be, not out of fear, but because he wanted to control the shape of this first conversation. Victor Halstead was a compact, well-maintained man in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had moved into something harder and more settled with age. He had dark gray hair under a black hat, and the particular posture of someone who was accustomed to having his arrival matter. He rode to about 10 feet from the porch and stopped and looked at Wyatt with an expression of measured pleasantness that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Mr. Calder," he said. Not a question. He'd done his preparation. "That's right," Wyatt said. "My name is Victor Halstead. I believe you're acquainted with my sister-in-law." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a court order signed by Judge Emmett Fry of Bisbee, authorizing the transfer of custody of the minor child Clara Voss to the Halstead Family Trust, pending a full hearing. I'm here to collect the child and ensure her welfare." Wyatt looked at the document in Halstead's extended hand. He did not move to take it. "My daughter's name is Clara Calder," he said. "She was adopted by me 11 days ago, registered in Pima County. You're welcome to verify it." The pleasant expression on Halstead's face didn't break, but something behind it recalculated. "Mr. Calder," he said, "I'm aware that a legal filing was made. My lawyers have been looking into it. A rushed adoption of a child not biologically related to you, conducted by a county justice of the peace in clear awareness of pending litigation in another jurisdiction, courts do not look favorably on that kind of arrangement. Courts also don't look favorably on custody claims brought by men with no direct biological connection to the child in question, Wyatt said. The child's mother is alive. The child now has a father with established legal residence in this territory. I'm not sure what claim you think you're walking in here with. Halstead looked at him steadily. I'm walking in here with a signed court order, he said. Signed by a judge in Bisbee, Wyatt said. This is Pima County. Jurisdiction can be established. You're welcome to try, Wyatt said. In the meantime, that order doesn't give you the right to remove a child from her legal guardian's property. If you believe you have a valid claim, file it in the appropriate court. I'll see you there. The silence between them stretched. One of the lawyer-looking men shifted on his horse. The others stayed still. Halstead looked at Wyatt for a long moment with those eyes that were doing something steady and cold behind the surface pleasantness. I'd like to speak to Evelyn, he said. My wife, Wyatt said, is not obligated to speak to you. The word wife landed in the space between them. Halstead's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Wyatt was watching for it. The pleasant surface cracked slightly, not into anger, but into something more controlled and more dangerous. Recalculation again. Assessment. I see you've been busy, Halstead said. I have a ranch to run, Wyatt said. Another long pause. Halstead looked at the house, then at Wyatt, then at the house again. Then he folded the document back into his coat. This isn't finished, he said. Not as a threat, as a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had resources to keep things unfinished for as long as necessary. I didn't think it was, Wyatt said. Halstead looked at him one more time. Then he turned his horse and rode back through the gate, his men following in a neat line, nobody rushing, nobody looking back. The kind of exit that said, we know where you are, and we're in no hurry. Wyatt stood on the porch and watched until they were out of sight. Then he went inside. Evelyn was in the kitchen, both hands flat on the table, not moving. Clara was on the floor against the far wall with her stick and her eyes on the door, alert, waiting. He's gone, Wyatt said. Evelyn let out a breath. What did he say? He's going to take it to court, Wyatt said. A proper court, not his judge in Bisbee. He'll file a challenge to the adoption, probably argue that it was done to circumvent legal process. He sat down at the table. He's not wrong that it was rushed. A judge is going to notice that. So we have to go to court, Evelyn said. We have to go to court, he said. She looked at the table. I've told you I can't afford lawyers. I know. And Victor can afford very good ones. I know. So what do we do? He didn't have a complete answer. He had pieces of one, the way he usually had pieces before they became something whole. We tell the truth, he said. We document everything. And we find someone to stand with us in that courtroom who knows more about the law than I do and is willing to work for less than Victor is paying his people. Evelyn looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. You make it sound manageable, she said. It isn't. No, he agreed. It isn't. But you're not She stopped. What? She shook her head slowly. Thomas would have been angry right now, she said. Frightened, probably, and then angry because of it, and then it would have been... She stopped again. You're just sitting there thinking. Getting angry doesn't help me think, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the window, arms crossed, looking out at the gate where the dust from Halstead's horses was still settling. He's going to bring everything into court, she said. Everything I've done wrong, every bad decision, the poverty, leaving without Clara's birth record. I had to leave it behind. It was at the house. He's going to make me look like exactly what he's been calling me. Her voice was controlled but tight. An unfit mother. You kept your daughter alive in the middle of the Arizona desert with a broken wrist, Wyatt said. We start there. Evelyn turned from the window. That's not how courts work. Maybe not, he said. But it's true. And truth is harder to demolish than people think, when you put it plainly enough. Clara got up from the floor and came to stand between them, which was something she did sometimes, not asking for attention, just positioning herself at the center of things. the way children did when they needed to be sure they were still there, still accounted for, still part of the shape of what was happening. Evelyn made promises he didn't know he could keep. But it was true, and Evelyn seemed to understand the difference, because she nodded once and went back to the counter, and there was a particular quality to the set of her shoulders that had something of the same quality he'd seen in her daughter. Braced, resolute, not without fear, but not governed by it either. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen and held her stick in both hands and said, "Good." Just that. Just good. And the words sat there in the kitchen between all three of them like a small, stubborn thing that intended to stay. The next morning, Wyatt rode to Cutter's Creek and asked around until he found the name of the best lawyer in the county who wasn't in anyone's pocket, which turned out to be a man in Tucson named Solomon Bryce, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, and losing fewer of them than anyone expected. He sent Bryce a letter that morning with the money he had in the strongbox under the floorboards of his bedroom, which was not nothing but was not enough. And he wrote it plainly. "Here's the situation, here's what we have, here's what we don't have. Tell me if you can help us." Then he rode home and told Evelyn what he'd done, and she looked at the number he'd spent, and her face went through several things at once. "That's a great deal of your money," she said. "It's money," he said. "Clara's not money." Evelyn looked at him for a long time. He couldn't read all of what was in her face, but he could read some of it, and what he read did not make him look away. "No," she said quietly, "she's not." Outside, the desert stretched away in every direction, heat-hazed and enormous, and indifferent to the small human decisions being made inside this house. But inside the house, those decisions were being made anyway, one at a time, with imperfect information and imperfect people, the way all the decisions that mattered ever were. Solomon Bryce arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday, 12 days after Wyatt's letter reached him. He was not what Wyatt had pictured. The name had suggested someone imposing, a large man, maybe, with the kind of physical presence that commanded a courtroom. What came through the gate instead was a lean, slightly stooped man in his late 50s with a threadbare jacket and a battered leather case, and the particular distracted expression of someone whose mind was always running slightly ahead of where his body was. He tied his horse at the post and came up to the porch and shook Wyatt's hand, and then immediately asked to see every document they had before he'd even accepted coffee. Wyatt spread everything on the kitchen table: the marriage certificate, the adoption filing, Kern's ledger entry, the letter from Halstead's lawyer that had arrived 4 days ago, formally notifying them of a challenge filed in Tucson District Court. Bryce read each one without comment, turning pages with the careful speed of someone who had learned to extract the essential thing from a document quickly and didn't need to perform thoroughness to prove he was being thorough. Evelyn stood near the window. Clara was outside with the hens, which had become her morning assignment. She'd appointed herself to it without being asked, and the hens had apparently accepted this arrangement. "The adoption will hold," Bryce said finally, not looking up from the last page. "Aldous Kern did it right. There's a question about jurisdiction and timing that Halstead's people will raise, but a rushed adoption isn't an invalid one. That's not where you're vulnerable." "Where are we vulnerable?" Evelyn asked. He looked up then. He had pale, sharp eyes that moved quickly when he was thinking. "The marriage," he said, "not legally. Legally, it's solid. But in a courtroom, in front of a judge, Halstead's lawyers are going to paint it as a transaction. A woman with no resources who needed legal cover, and a man who provided it in exchange for—" He paused. "They'll leave what it was in exchange for somewhat vague and let the judge fill in the blanks." "That's not what it was," Wyatt said. "I know that," Bryce said. "I need the judge to know it." He leaned back in the chair. "Which means I need to understand what it actually was. And I need you both to be honest with me, because I can't defend what I don't know." What followed was the better part of 2 hours that neither Wyatt nor Evelyn would have described as comfortable. Bryce asked questions with the relentless patience of someone who had been lied to by enough clients to know exactly how to peel back the layers of what people chose to present versus what was actually true. He asked about Thomas. He asked about the bruises. He asked about the night Evelyn left and what she took and what she left and why. He asked Wyatt how he'd found them and what the first 3 days had looked like and why he'd made the choices he'd made. He wrote things down in a small notebook in handwriting that was nearly illegible. When he was done, he sat quietly for a moment, looking at his notes. "Here's the problem," he said. "Halstead has money, which means he has time. He can drag this out for months. Continuances, additional filings, requests for evaluation of the child's living conditions. Every delay costs you and costs him nothing. He's banking on you breaking before the case does." "We won't break," Evelyn said. "I've heard that before," Bryce said, not unkindly. "It's usually true until it isn't. Pressure has a way of finding the places people don't know are weak." He looked at Wyatt. "His other angle is going to be this, that the adoption wasn't made out of genuine paternal feeling, but out of legal strategy. If he can establish that, the judge may look at the whole arrangement with skepticism. He'll bring witnesses who knew your situation, known as a solitary man, no connection to children, no prior relationship with this family. He'll argue you're a stranger playing father." "He'd be wrong," Wyatt said. "I know he'd be wrong," Bryce said, "but wrong arguments win in court all the time when they're made well, and the other side isn't prepared." He closed the notebook. "I need character witnesses, people who know you, who can testify to who you are. Not what you've told them, what they've actually observed." Wyatt thought about that. He'd spent 8 years making himself hard to know. It was not a problem that had a quick solution. "I'll find them," he said. "And I need something else," Bryce said. He looked at Evelyn. "I need you to be willing to tell everything, not just the parts that make you look good, the whole of it. The marriage to Thomas, the circumstances you were living in, the choices you made and why, the night you left. Halstead's lawyers will bring it all out anyway, but there's a difference between a witness who is broken under cross-examination and one who has already given their account plainly and left nothing to be extracted." Evelyn looked at the table. A muscle in her jaw moved. "They're going to make me sound like a terrible mother," she said. "They're going to try," Bryce said. "Our job is to get there first and tell it differently. Not spin it. Tell it accurately, with context. A woman who stayed in a bad situation too long is not the same as an unfit mother, but the jury, and in this case it's a judge, which is its own set of considerations, needs to understand the difference." He paused. "Can you do that?" Evelyn looked at Bryce for a long moment. He held the look steadily, not demanding, just waiting. "Yes," she said. Bryce nodded. "Good." He picked up his coffee, which he'd let go cold. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. That's not much time, but it's enough if we use it right." He looked at them both. "I want you to understand something. Halstead has more resources than we do. He has connections in that courthouse I don't have. The judge assigned a man named Rutherford Crane. I know his record. He's not corrupt, but he values order and property and established standing. He's going to look at Halstead and see stability. He's going to look at you two and see a mess he has to sort out." He set the cup down. "So we have to give him something that matters more to him than order. We have to give him something that's undeniably true and that makes the right answer obvious." "What's that?" Wyatt asked. "Clara," Bryce said simply. "Everything comes back to Clara. Halstead's case is built on the idea that she's better off with resources, with a family name, with established wealth. Our case has to be built on who she actually is and what she actually needs, and sometimes the clearest argument is the simplest one." He left that afternoon with his notebook and his worn leather case, and he'd be back in Tucson preparing, and they would meet again the morning of the hearing. After he rode out, Wyatt sat on the porch steps and looked at the empty road for a while. Clara came around the side of the house with 3 eggs cradled in her apron. She'd converted the front of her dress into a carrying pouch with the practical ingenuity she brought to everything, and she sat down beside him on the steps and held them in her lap carefully. "Who was that man?" she asked. "Lawyer," Wyatt said. "He's going to help us in court." Clara considered this. "Is he good?" "I think so." "Is good going to be enough?" He looked at her. She was looking at the eggs in her lap, adjusting them slightly so they were more stable. "I don't know," he said. "But it's what we have." She nodded, the way she nodded at practical assessments. Not satisfied exactly, just accepting. Then she looked at him sideways. "Are you scared?" He thought about whether to answer honestly. He always came down on the same side with her. "A little," he said. "Me too," she said. "But I was scared in the desert, and we got through that." "We did," he said. She stood up with her eggs and went inside, and he stayed on the steps and thought that he'd been offered a great deal of comfort in his life, most of it useless, and that the most useful piece of it had just been delivered by a 4-year-old with eggs in her apron. The 3 weeks before the hearing had a particular quality of tension that Wyatt recognized from his war years, not the sharp, immediate tension of the moment of danger, but the longer, grinding tension of waiting for something you couldn't control and couldn't stop from coming. He worked the ranch, and he helped Bryce by writing out everything he could remember, and he found his character witnesses. There were only 2 he trusted to stand up under cross-examination. Garrett, his neighbor from 20 miles west, who'd known him for 6 years and whose opinion of Wyatt was accurate and unsentimental, and who said yes without being asked twice. And Aldous Kern, who had conducted both the marriage and the adoption, and who said he'd testify to what he'd witnessed and nothing more, which was exactly what they needed. Evelyn spent those weeks writing, not letters, her own account, the whole of it, in her own words, in the order it had happened, in the specific concrete detail that Bryce had asked for. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after Clara was asleep, left hand moving across the pages with the controlled concentration of someone doing something that hurt but couldn't be done any other way. Once late, Wyatt came into the kitchen for water and found her sitting with the pen down, looking at what she'd written, and the expression on her face was not the grief he'd expected. It was something harder and more complicated. The expression of someone who had just made themselves look at something clearly for the first time and was deciding what to do with what they saw. She looked up when she heard him. "I made a lot of mistakes," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying that to be hard on myself. I'm saying it because reading what I wrote..." She looked at the pages. "I keep wanting to explain each decision, make it make sense. And it does make sense, in context, but it also... I stayed too long. I knew, and I stayed anyway." He got his water. He sat down across from her because it seemed like the right thing to do. Not to fix it, but just to be there for the saying of it. "You left," he said. "Nearly too late." "But you left." She looked at him. "You keep saying that." "Because it matters," he said. "You could have not left. You left." She was quiet for a moment. "I left because of Clara," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm not sure I would have left for myself." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "That probably sounds terrible." "It sounds human," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the pen and went back to writing, and he finished his water and went back to bed. The morning they rode to Tucson, Clara came downstairs in the one dress that could be called presentable, dark blue cotton that Evelyn had mended twice and pressed with the flat iron the night before. And she had her stick in her hand, and she looked at Wyatt with the clear, direct look she used when she was asking something serious. "Can I bring it?" she asked. "The stick." He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the stick. "Yes," Evelyn said. They rode in the wagon Wyatt had borrowed from Garrett, who'd also pressed 2 shirts on him and told him to stand up straight in the courtroom, which Wyatt appreciated in the way you appreciated advice you hadn't asked for, but that was correct. Bryce met them outside the courthouse, a solid stone building on the main street of Tucson that had the particular gravity of places where decisions got made. He looked at Clara and the stick, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one, and he said nothing about either. Halstead was already inside. He was standing near the far wall with his 2 lawyers, younger men, well-dressed, carrying the expensive document cases that Wyatt had learned to associate with people who were paid to be thorough. And he looked at Wyatt when they came in with that same measured pleasantness that still didn't go anywhere near his eyes. He looked at Clara, and what was in his face then was not pleasant at all. It was the look of someone examining an asset that had been incorrectly filed. Clara looked back at him with her particular brand of focused, assessing attention, and then looked away, which Wyatt thought was about the most perfect response available. Judge Rutherford Crane was exactly what Bryce had described. A square-built man in his 60s with the face of someone who had been making decisions under pressure for long enough that he'd stopped finding it difficult and started finding it routine. He had no warmth in his expression, but he had something that was arguably more valuable in a courtroom. He appeared to be paying actual attention. Halstead's lead lawyer went first. His name was a man called Mercer, and he was good, smooth in the way of someone who had practiced being smooth until it was genuine, and he built his case the way a competent man built anything, foundation first. He established that Thomas Halstead had died intestate on matters regarding his daughter's guardianship. He established that Evelyn had fled a legitimate legal proceeding in Bisbee. He established, with carefully selected language, that she had been living in poverty and poor conditions before her flight, and that she had taken the child into a dangerous environment and nearly killed her in the process. Each point was documented. Each document was submitted cleanly. Then he moved to the marriage and the adoption. He used the word arrangement. He used the phrase expedient circumstances. He used the phrase barely acquainted without ever quite saying that two people who'd known each other for 12 days shouldn't be allowed to make legal decisions, because he didn't need to say it. He just put the number in front of the judge and let it sit there. He called one witness of his own, a woman from Bisbee who had been Evelyn's neighbor, a Mrs. Adler, who testified to having seen Thomas Halstead strike Evelyn on 2 occasions and having done nothing, a detail she delivered with what appeared to be genuine guilt, but who also testified that Evelyn's housekeeping had been irregular and that she had seemed, in Mrs. Adler's assessment, overwhelmed. It was not a devastating portrait, but it was a damaging one, painted with careful, moderate strokes that added up. Bryce stood up when Mercer sat down, and he called Evelyn first. She took the stand with the same quality she brought to everything difficult. Not graceful, not composed in the performed way of someone who had rehearsed composure, but steady. The real kind of steady. The kind that came from having already looked at the worst of it and decided you were going to say it anyway. Bryce asked her to tell the court what her marriage to Thomas Halstead had been like. She told it. She didn't perform distress, and she didn't minimize it. She said plainly that Thomas drank, and that his temper when he drank was a thing the household arranged itself around, and that the bruises on her arms in the weeks before she left were not from falling. She said it in the matter-of-fact way of someone recounting the weather rather than the theatrical way of someone building a case, and Wyatt thought that the matter-of-fact quality was going to be more persuasive than drama would have been. Mercer cross-examined her on the flight from Bisbee, on the missing documents, on the water miscalculation, on Clara's exposure to the desert. Each question was precise. Each one was designed to sit inside the answer and expand. Evelyn answered each one without elaborating beyond what was asked, which was what Bryce had told her to do, and which was clearly harder than it sounded because there were moments when the muscle in her jaw was working. At one point, Mercer asked, in a tone of mild curiosity, "Mrs. Calder, you're using that name now, is that right?" And when she said yes, he paused just long enough to let the newness of it be present in the room. "When you made the decision to marry Mr. Calder, were you motivated by romantic feeling or by the legal advantages such a marriage would provide?" Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Both things can be true over time," she said. "What it began as and what it is now are not the same." Mercer smiled slightly. "What it is now," he said, "you've been married for..." He checked his papers. 22 days. "Yes," she said, "and in 22 days it has become something other than a legal arrangement." "In 22 days," Evelyn said, "I have watched a man sit on the floor of a sick room for 3 days to keep my daughter and me alive. I've watched him fix a hinge on a chicken coop because my daughter asked him why it wobbled. I've watched him spend the majority of his savings on a lawyer because he said Clara was not money." She paused. "You can call that a legal arrangement if you want. I'm calling it something else." The courtroom was quiet. Mercer moved on. Bryce called Kern and Garrett in sequence, both brief, both plain-spoken. Kern described the adoption proceeding as regular in all respects that mattered. Garrett described Wyatt as a man he'd known for 6 years who was spare with words but reliable with deeds, and who'd helped him move a herd through a flooding creek 3 years ago without being asked and without expecting anything for it. Then Bryce called Wyatt. Mercer's cross was the sharpest thing in the room. He went at the timeline first, 12 days between first meeting and legal filing. Had Mr. Calder considered that perhaps his judgment had been affected by circumstances? That a man alone for 8 years suddenly presented with a woman and child in crisis might not be the most objective assessor of what was best for the child. Wyatt said he'd considered it. Mercer asked how he'd resolved the question. Wyatt said he'd resolved it by watching Clara carry her mother's weight for a day and a night, without complaining and deciding that a child who did that deserved someone in her corner. Mercer paused. Then he said, with the smooth patience of someone setting a trap, "You've described a very affecting scene, Mr. Calder. But affection isn't fatherhood. What do you know about raising a child?" "Nothing," Wyatt said. "I know nothing about it. I'm learning." "You're learning," Mercer repeated. "Same as everyone does," Wyatt said, "unless Mr. Halstead was born knowing." Judge Crane made a small sound. It wasn't a laugh, but it wasn't nothing. Mercer changed direction. He asked about the solitary years, about the war, about the deliberate isolation, the absence of community, the fact that this man had gone out of his way to live disconnected from other people. Was that the environment in which a child should be raised? "People change," Wyatt said. "In 12 days?" "The change started before that," Wyatt said. 12 days just showed me what it was for." Mercer sat down. Then Bryce said quietly, "Your Honor, I'd like to call one more witness." Crane looked at his docket. "This isn't on your list, Mr. Bryce." "No, sir," Bryce said. "I'd like to call Clara Calder." The room shifted. Mercer was on his feet immediately, objecting. The child was 4. The child could not be expected to give reliable testimony. The child was clearly susceptible to coaching. Crane held up a hand and looked at Bryce. "Counsel," he said, "I'm not going to put a 4-year-old on that stand and let her be cross-examined." "I'm not asking you to," Bryce said. "I'm asking you to let her speak, briefly, to say what she wants to say. No examination, no cross. Just let her say it." Crane looked at the room. He looked at Halstead, who was very still. He looked at Wyatt and Evelyn. He looked at the small girl sitting in the gallery between the two of them, holding a broken stick across her knees. "This is irregular," he said. "Yes, sir," Bryce agreed. Crane was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Come up here, young lady. You don't have to sit in the chair. You can stand right here if you want." Clara stood up. She held the stick in both hands. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had decided to do a difficult thing and was going to do it at her own speed. She stood in front of the judge and looked at him. "What's that you're carrying?" Crane asked. "My stick," Clara said. "What do you use it for?" "I used it to protect my mama," she said, "in the desert, when she was sick." Crane looked at her. "How long were you out there with her?" "A whole day and another night," Clara said. "I kept watch." "With the stick?" "Yes, sir." She paused. "I know it's just a stick. It probably wouldn't have stopped anything real, but I didn't have anything else and I wasn't going to leave her." The courtroom was very quiet. "Mr. Calder," Crane said, not looking at Wyatt, "do you know who he is?" "He's my father," Clara said. Immediately. No hesitation. "He hasn't always been your father," Crane said gently. "He's only recently become—" "He carried my mama a whole mile," Clara said, "in the heat. And he sat with us for 3 days when she was sick, and he didn't sleep much. I heard him at night. And he fixed the chicken coop because I asked him why the door wobbled, and he said I could keep the stick, and he spent his money on the lawyer because he said I wasn't money." She gripped the stick. "I know it hasn't been long, but he doesn't—" She seemed to search for the right words, and what she came up with was something she'd clearly been thinking about for a while. "He doesn't look at me like I'm something that belongs somewhere. He looks at me like I'm just me." She looked at the judge. "That man over there." She didn't point. She just turned her head slightly toward where Halstead was sitting. "He's never said my name, not once. Every time he talks about me, he says the child or the girl, not my name." She looked back at Crane. "My name is Clara." Nobody said anything. Crane nodded slowly. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "You can go sit down." She walked back to her seat and sat between Wyatt and Evelyn and put the stick across her knees again and looked straight ahead. Mercer rose for closing argument and did his job well. He returned to the timeline, to the expedience, to the question of what a child needed versus what this particular arrangement could reliably provide. He reminded the court that Victor Halstead could offer stability, resources, education, a family name. He was measured and professional, and he made his points clearly. Bryce's closing was shorter. He said that the court had before it a man who had everything money could buy and a child who was, in his assessment, a piece of property that had been incorrectly filed. He said the court also had before it a child who had spent a day and a night alone in the Arizona desert guarding her mother with a stick, and a man who'd carried that mother a mile in June heat for no reason other than that the child was standing there asking him to. He said the question before the court was not which option had more resources, but which option understood that Clara was a person. He sat down. Crane took a recess. An hour. Wyatt sat on a bench outside the courtroom with Evelyn and Clara, and nobody said much. Clara organized the buttons on her dress by size. Evelyn held the splinted wrist in her lap and looked at the floor. Wyatt looked at the wall. When Crane came back, his face was the same as it had been all morning. The face of a man doing a job he'd been doing for a long time. He looked at his papers and then at the room. He said that the Bisbee proceedings were outside his jurisdiction and he would not comment on them. He said that the marriage and adoption, while conducted under time pressure, had been conducted legally and in good faith, and that rushed did not mean fraudulent. He said that the evidence before him regarding Clara's life with her mother and her life at the Calder Ranch did not support a finding of parental unfitness. He said that the Halstead family's claim rested on bloodline and resources, and that while resources mattered, they were not in themselves evidence that a child's welfare was better served by removal from her living parent and legal family. He said the petition was denied. He said it plainly, in the same voice he'd used for everything, and then he looked at his next case. Wyatt heard Evelyn exhale beside him, a slow, long breath, the kind that came from somewhere deep. He didn't move for a moment. He just sat with it, the way you sat with things after a long time of carrying them. Clara looked at the stick in her lap. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara nodded once. She looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. "Okay," she said. And then after a moment, "Can we go home?" He looked at her, this small, serious person with her cracked stick and her organized buttons and her way of asking questions that went straight to the thing that mattered. And something in his chest did something he didn't have a name for and didn't try to find one. "Yes," he said. "We can go home." Across the room, Victor Halstead was already speaking quietly to his lawyers, and his face had the look of a man recalculating rather than conceding, and Wyatt was not foolish enough to think this was entirely over. But it was over for today. The judge had said the word, and it had a weight that Halstead's money couldn't immediately lift, and today was what they had. He stood up. Evelyn stood. Clara stood and tucked the stick under her arm and took her mother's hand, and the three of them walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon light of Tucson, which was bright and hot and indifferent to outcomes the way afternoon light always was. It was enough for now that they were walking out together. The ride home from Tucson took most of the afternoon. Nobody talked much for the first hour. That was fine. Wyatt drove the wagon and watched the road and let the silence do what it needed to do, which was to give everyone room to come down from the particular height of the day. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, the splinted wrist resting on top, and she looked at the desert passing on either side with the expression of someone who was still processing something too large to hold all at once. Claire was in the bed of the wagon behind them, lying on her back with the stick balanced across her chest, watching the sky go past. After a while, Claire said, "There's a hawk." Wyatt looked up. There was circling high and slow on a thermal, barely moving its wings. "Red-tailed," he said. "How can you tell from here?" "The way it holds its wings, flat mostly. Red-tails soar more than they flap." Claire considered this. "Do they live alone?" "Usually hunt alone," he said. "Nest with a mate." "So they're not lonely," she said. "They're just working." He didn't answer that because it didn't need one. and also because it landed somewhere in him with a precision he hadn't expected from a 4-year-old observing a bird. Evelyn glanced at him sidelong. He kept his eyes on the road. They got home after dark, which meant feeding the hens by lantern light and getting the horse settled and the wagon put away. And by the time they were done, Clara was asleep on her feet, and Evelyn carried her inside without waking her and put her to bed still in the blue dress, which would need pressing again tomorrow, and didn't matter tonight. Wyatt sat on the porch steps in the dark and listened to the desert and thought about what Bryce had said before they'd parted in Tucson. He'd pulled Wyatt aside while Evelyn was signing the last of the court papers, and he'd said, quietly and without softening it, "Halstead will appeal." Maybe not the jurisdiction ruling, Crane was right about that and everybody in that room knew it, but he'll find another angle. A man like that doesn't absorb a loss and let it settle. He files something else. He waits. Wyatt had nodded. He'd expected it. What he hadn't expected was how much it would cost him to hear it confirmed out loud. After an afternoon of sitting in that courtroom watching Clara speak to a judge with a broken stick in her hands, there was a particular kind of tired that came not from the body, but from the sustained effort of holding a difficult thing in place through will alone, and he was feeling it now in a way that made the steps feel harder than they were, and the night feel longer. He heard the screen door, and then Evelyn sat down beside him on the steps. Not in her chair. On the steps, close enough that he was aware of her. She didn't say anything for a minute. He didn't either. "Bryce told me about the appeal," she said. "I figured he would. Are you—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Are you still willing to do this, knowing it's not done?" He looked at the sky. The stars were fully out, the whole density of them, the way they got out here without anything to compete with. "I live 12 miles from the nearest town in the Arizona desert," he said. "I don't do things I'm not willing to finish." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I need you to understand something." She said it with the particular weight of something that had been sitting unspoken for a while and had decided tonight was the night. "I came into your life at a point where I had nothing. No money, no legal standing, no family, no options that weren't closing, and you opened your house and your strongbox in your name, and I took all of it because I had to." She paused. "I don't want to be a woman who just takes. I've had enough of that running in one direction already." "You're not taking," he said. "I feel like I am." "What you feel like and what's true aren't always the same thing," he said. He turned and looked at her, which he didn't always do when they were having difficult conversations. He found it easier to look at the horizon, but this seemed to require the other thing. "I made the choices I made. Nobody pressured me. I had options, and I chose what I chose. That's not something you did to me." She looked back at him. In the dark, her face was mostly shadow and the lamplight from the window behind them, and she had the kind of expression that didn't translate cleanly into a single emotion. Too many things at once, layered on top of each other, the way life layered things on a person who had been through a lot of it. "What did you choose?" she asked quietly. "I mean, when you think about it now, what was it actually for?" It was the question he'd been circling for weeks without landing on. He thought about it now, deliberately, the way you thought about something when you decided to stop avoiding it. "I've been out here 8 years, he said, telling myself that being alone was a decision I made, that I chose it, that it was better than the alternative." He looked at the stars. "I think I was lying to myself. I think I stopped trying, because trying was hard, and I'd been through things that made hard feel impossible, and it was easier to call it a choice than to call it what it actually was." "Which was?" "Giving up," he said flatly. "Dressed up as wisdom." Evelyn was quiet. "And then a kid stood in a dry wash with a broken stick," he said, "and she didn't give up. She had less reason to hold on than I did, and she held on anyway, and I don't know. Something in that—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know what to call what's happened in this house in the last 2 months. I don't have a clean name for it, but I know it's not nothing, and I know I'm not willing to go back to what it was before." The night held that for a moment, just held it. "That's the most I've heard you say at once," Evelyn said. "I know," he said. "Don't get used to it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the shape of one, brief and real, and he felt the slight shift of her shoulder against his because she was sitting that close, and neither of them moved away from it. "I don't know what we are," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I know what we are on paper. I know what Clara thinks we are, which is its own argument, but I don't—" She shook her head slightly. "I don't want to mistake gratitude for something it isn't. I've done that before." "I know," he said. "And I don't want you to mistake obligation for something it isn't. You've done a great deal because you felt responsible, and responsible isn't the same as—" "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "I know the difference," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think about it." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamplight from the window fell across the side of her face, and the night was very still. "Okay," she said finally, quietly. They sat on the steps for a while after that without talking, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling, and the desert did what it always did at night, which was to make itself vast and present and indifferent in a way that was somehow comforting rather than lonely. And Wyatt thought that was probably something he'd never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't lived in it. Bryce's letter arrived 3 weeks later. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table while Evelyn was outside with Clara, who had recently become interested in which desert plants were edible and had been systematically investigating this with the focused intensity she brought to everything. He read the letter twice, then set it down. Halstead had filed in territorial court, not a custody appeal, something different, a challenge to the adoption on grounds of fraud, arguing that the adoption had been entered into not out of genuine intent to establish a parental relationship, but specifically to frustrate a legitimate legal proceeding. It was, Bryce wrote, a harder argument to win on Halstead's side than it looked, but it was also harder to defend against than the original custody claim because it put the question of Wyatt's intent at the center rather than Clara's welfare, and intent was harder to prove cleanly than facts. He wrote that he would defend it. He wrote that they would need to come to Tucson again, probably in 6 weeks. He wrote that the cost would be additional, and he listed the number, which was significant. Wyatt sat with the letter for a long time. Then he went outside. Evelyn saw his face when he came through the gate, and she said, "What is it?" He handed her the letter. She read it standing in the yard with Clara crouched nearby, examining a prickly pear with a stick. A different stick, one she'd found last week and was evaluating as a potential replacement, though the original still lived on the shelf inside the back door. Evelyn's face went through several things as she read. When she finished, she looked up. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Wyatt said. "He's going to keep filing things until we run out of money to fight them." "That's the strategy, yes." She looked at the letter again. Then she looked at Clara, who was now poking the prickly pear experimentally and narrating what she observed in the quiet, absorbed murmur of a scientist conducting a trial. Then she looked at Wyatt. "We need to end it," she said. "Not just win the next round. End it." "I've been thinking the same thing. Do you have an idea?" He'd had the beginning of one since reading the letter, the rough shape of it the way ideas always started for him. "Halstead's afraid of exposure," he said. "He's operated in Bisbee and the surrounding territory for 20 years with a judge in his pocket and money moving in directions that probably don't bear looking at. He came after you because he assumed you had no resources and no one who'd listen to you." He paused. What he didn't calculate for was someone who had a reason to start asking questions about him. Evelyn looked at him carefully. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that lawyers and newspapers and territorial officials find interesting," he said. "The judge in Bisbee who signed those original orders, a judge signs a preliminary custody order in 5 days without a hearing based on a claim from a man who isn't the child's biological relative, while the child's living mother is in the same jurisdiction. That's irregular. Someone was standing to ask about that, asking loudly enough, in the right places? Could make Halstead more interested in dropping this than continuing it," Evelyn said. "It's not guaranteed," he said. "But men like Halstead are careful about their arrangements. They don't like light on them." She thought about it. He could see her working through it, the same way she worked through everything. Not rushing, not reacting, just thinking. "Bryce would know how to do that?" she asked. "I'll ask him." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at Clara, who had apparently concluded her examination of the prickly pear and was now standing and looking at them both with the clear expectation that something important had just been decided and she would like to know what it was. "Is it bad?" Clara asked. "It's more fighting," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her mother, then at Wyatt. She reached down and picked up the new stick she'd been evaluating and looked at it and then set it back down. She went inside and came out with the original one, the cracked, dry, worn-smooth original, and she held it in both hands and looked at them. "Okay," she said, "we keep going." Wyatt wrote to Bryce that afternoon. What followed over the next 6 weeks was less dramatic than the courtroom and more grinding in the way that the real work of difficult things usually was. Bryce, it turned out, had been aware of the Bisbee judge for some time. A man named Horace Pelham, whose record had attracted quiet attention from people with official interest in such things, but who had never been examined closely enough to become a problem. He knew a correspondent at the territorial newspaper who had been looking for a thread to pull on. He knew a man in the territorial governor's office who had his own reasons to be interested in mining money moving in unusual ways. He pulled the thread, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that a thread pulled too hard broke, and a thread pulled wrong unraveled the wrong thing. Wyatt and Evelyn didn't see most of this directly. What they saw were the letters that arrived, each one moving the picture forward by a degree. Pelham was under review. Halstead's filing in territorial court had been assigned to a judge who was not Pelham and not in Pelham's network. A territorial official had made inquiries into the original Bisbee proceedings. These were not dramatic events. They were the small administrative movements of a system being asked to look at itself, which it did slowly and without fanfare and occasionally with results. The result, in this case, arrived 8 weeks after Bryce pulled the first thread. Halstead withdrew the fraud challenge, not publicly, not with explanation. The filing simply disappeared from the court docket, withdrawn by his lawyers with a brief and uninformative notice. Bryce's letter explaining it was 3 sentences. "The challenge has been withdrawn. I believe the inquiry into Pelham's conduct was persuasive. I will file the appropriate responses to close the matter on our end." Wyatt read it at the kitchen table in the morning and set it down and sat with it. Evelyn read it standing up, the way she'd read the bad news, and then she put it flat on the table and put both hands on top of it and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Clara was eating breakfast. She looked at her mother's face and then at Wyatt's. "Is it over?" she asked. "The legal part," Wyatt said. "Yes." "What about the other part?" He looked at her. "What other part?" "The part where he might do something else." She said it with the matter-of-fact seriousness she used for accurate assessments of reality. "He doesn't seem like someone who gives up." "He might not give up," Wyatt said, "but he'll be careful. Men who are worried about someone looking into their business are careful." Clara thought about this. She picked up her spoon. "So we watch," she said. "We watch," he agreed. She nodded and went back to her breakfast. And that was the end of the most important legal discussion the 3 of them would have about Victor Halstead, because there was nothing more to extract from it, and Clara did not linger on things past their usefulness. The weeks that settled in after that had a quality Wyatt didn't know what to do with at first. He'd been in some state of active tension for so long, since before they came, if he was honest, the low-grade tension of a man who had spent 8 years keeping everything at arm's length, that the absence of it felt strange. Not bad. Strange. Like a sound you'd been hearing so long you stopped noticing it, and then it stopped, and the quiet it left was louder than the sound had been. He noticed things he hadn't been noticing. He noticed that Clara had taken over a particular corner of the porch for what she called her collection, which was an arrangement of rocks, feathers, a desiccated beetle casing, 3 different varieties of seed pod, and the new stick, which had been officially promoted to secondary status after careful evaluation. She tended this collection with the systematic attention she gave everything, and she could tell you exactly where each item had come from and what made it worth keeping. He noticed that Evelyn had started reading in the evenings. He'd found 3 books at the general store in Cutter's Creek over the course of several trips. Nothing special, just whatever was available, and she read them in the lamplight at the kitchen table with the same focused quiet she brought to everything that was hers to do. Sometimes he sat across from her and read the paper, or worked on accounts, and they didn't talk much, and it was the most comfortable he'd been in the same room as another person in longer than he could clearly remember. He noticed that the house was louder than it used to be. Not always, not in ways that were constant, but there were sounds in it now that hadn't been there before. Footsteps. Clara's running commentary on whatever she was investigating. The sound of Evelyn's voice carrying from the back of the house when she was talking to Clara at bedtime. Small, ordinary, human sounds that the house had been missing for years and had apparently needed because the walls seemed to hold them differently than they held silence. He noticed that he was sleeping better. He didn't examine this too closely. One evening in early September, the heat had finally begun to break into something more bearable. He was on the porch after dark when Evelyn came out and didn't sit in her chair. She sat on the steps beside him, the way she'd started doing instead of the chair, and she had something in her hand that she was turning over. It was his sister's thimble. He'd kept it in the trunk in the spare room, the room that was now Clara's, and he'd forgotten it was there until apparently Clara had found it and brought it to Evelyn because she didn't know what it was. "I found out what it was," Evelyn said, holding it up. "Clara described it to me, and I told her." "She can have it," he said, "if she wants." Evelyn looked at it. "She asked me who it belonged to. I didn't know what to tell her." "My sister," he said. "She died a long time ago, before the war." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not elaborate, just that." "It was a long time ago," he said. Then, because it was the truth, "I still think about her." What was she like? He hadn't talked about his sister to anyone in years. He thought about refusing, the way he usually refused invitations to talk about the past, and then thought about what he'd said on this same porch weeks ago about calling cowardice by the name of wisdom. "Stubborn," he said. Funny. She had opinions about everything, and she was wrong about some of them, and right about most of them, and she never had any trouble telling you which was which. He looked at the thimble in Evelyn's hand. She would have liked Clara. Evelyn smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes, and he'd seen it enough times now to know it from the polite version. "Clara would have catalogued her," she said, "filed her under interesting things worth keeping." He almost smiled. Probably. She held the thimble out. He took it and turned it in his fingers and set it on the step beside him. They sat without talking for a while, and the night was cool enough to be pleasant now, and somewhere out in the scrub something was making the particular sound that meant rain was coming, which was information the desert gave you if you'd been out here long enough to read it. "I've been thinking about something," Evelyn said. "Tell me." "This thing we are," she said. "You said you don't have a name for it. I've been turning that over." She looked at the stars. "I think that's all right. I think maybe we're not supposed to name it yet. I think some things need time to become what they are before you put a word on them." "I think so too," he said. "I'm not—" She paused. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not someone who trusts easily anymore. Maybe I never was, but I'm less so now than before. I'm going to have moments where I pull back for no reason that makes external sense, and that's not about you. It's about—" "I know what it's about," he said. She looked at him. "You do?" "I've had 8 years of pulling back for no reason that makes external sense," he said. "I know what that looks like from the inside." Something in her face shifted. Not opened exactly. She was not a woman who opened easily, which he understood from the inside out, but settled. Like something that had been held slightly braced became, for a moment, less so. "We're a mess," she said. "We are," he agreed. "Two people with significant damage," he said. "You can say it." "I was going to say history," she said. "But yes, damage also. And a 4-year-old who is probably going to be more competent than both of us by the time she's 8. Evelyn laughed. A real one, brief and genuine, and it went into the night air, and the night held it. "Probably," she said. They sat together on the steps in the cooling night, and the rain smell was getting stronger in the west. And he thought about the particular thing that Bryce had said to him after the hearing, that last quiet conversation outside the courtroom. He'd said, "You know, most men in your position would have done the practical thing and nothing else, arranged the paperwork and kept their distance. You didn't do that. And Wyatt hadn't known how to answer it then, and he still didn't. Not in any way that was clean and simple. Because the truth was, there wasn't a moment where he'd made a decision about Clara or about Evelyn. There were just a series of smaller moments, each one just the next obvious thing, and at some point the obvious things had added up to something he couldn't have predicted from the outside. That was probably the truest thing about how lives changed, he thought. Not in large, single decisions, but in the accumulation of small ones, each unremarkable on its own, that together made something you couldn't undo and didn't want to. Clara appeared at the screen door. "It smells like rain," she announced. "It's coming," Wyatt said. "Maybe an hour." She pushed through the door and sat on the step below them and tipped her head back to look at the sky. She'd brought the original stick, which went with her to bed the way other children took stuffed animals, and she held it loosely in her lap. "I like rain," she said. "We didn't get much in Bisbee, not like this." "Desert rain is different," Evelyn said. "It smells different." "It smells like something starting," Clara said. Nobody corrected this because there was nothing to correct. They sat there, the three of them on the porch steps, while the rain came in from the west the way desert rain did, not gradually, not politely, but all at once, arriving in a rush of wind and the smell of wet earth that was unlike anything else. And the first drops hit the porch rail, and then the whole thing opened up, and it came down hard and fast the way it only did in the desert, and the night filled with the sound of it. Clara held her hand out into the rain and watched it hit her palm. "Does it always rain like this?" she asked. "Not always," Wyatt said. "When it does it right." She pulled her hand back and dried it on her dress, and looked at the rain for a long moment. Then she looked at Wyatt with the direct, assessing look that he'd learned was just how she looked at things she wanted to understand clearly. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Really, not just probably. He thought about the honest answer, which was the only kind he gave her. He thought about Halstead, who had withdrawn but not disappeared, about the years of work still ahead of rebuilding what had been depleted, the strongbox, the fences, the south pasture gate, which still wasn't right, about the long, complicated work of three people learning to be a family, which was the kind of work that didn't have a finish line and rewarded you for the doing of it rather than the completion. He thought about Clara in the wash, holding her stick. He thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table writing the truth of her life down in plain words, because that was what was required. He thought about his sister's thimble on the step beside him, and 8 years of chosen silence, and a hawk riding a thermal in the afternoon sky above the Tucson road. He thought about how sometimes the most important things in a life were not the things you chose in a single moment, but the things you kept choosing, day after day, in the small and glamorous accumulation of ordinary decisions, to stay, to show up, to tell the truth, to fix the gate, to make the eggs the way someone liked them. "I think so," he said. "I think if we keep doing what we've been doing, not perfectly, not without problems, but if we just keep doing the next right thing as it comes." He paused. "Yes, I think we're going to be okay." Clara considered this. She looked at the rain. She looked at the stick in her lap, the cracked, dry old stick that had started all of this, or had been the beginning of what he could see of it, anyway. Then she put it carefully against the porch post, where it would stay dry under the overhang, and she leaned back against Evelyn's leg and looked out at the rain with the particular quality of stillness that he'd come to understand meant she was content. Evelyn put her hand on Clara's hair. Wyatt looked at the rain. They stayed like that until the rain began to ease, which it did the same way it had come. Quickly, without ceremony, the desert taking back its intensity and leaving behind the clean smell of wet earth and the sound of water running somewhere in the wash to the east. The stars came back in pieces as the clouds moved through, first one and then a dozen, the familiar dense scatter of them. Claire's breathing slowed. She'd fallen asleep against Evelyn's leg, upright on the step, with the absolute commitment to sleep that only small children managed. Evelyn looked down at her and then at Wyatt. He stood up and lifted Clara carefully. She was heavier than she'd been when he'd first carried her 2 months ago, which was not a long time and was also longer than he could cleanly measure by feeling. And she shifted against his shoulder and didn't wake, and he carried her inside and put her in her bed in the room that had been his sister's room for a while, and his spare room for a long time, and was now, plainly and without need of further discussion, Clara's room. He set her down and pulled the quilt up and stood there for a moment in the dark. The stick was still on the porch. She'd remember it in the morning and go get it, and he'd watch her do it, and she'd probably examine the porch post while she was out there and find something worth noting and come back with the information in her face the way she always did. He knew this because he knew her now, in the practical, accumulated way you knew people you lived with. Not completely, not without gaps, but genuinely, in the way that mattered. He went back to the porch. Evelyn was still sitting on the steps, looking at the wet desert, and she looked up when he came back out. "She's out," he said. "She sleeps like she's been unplugged," Evelyn said. He sat back down on the steps. The night air after the rain was the best thing the desert offered, cool and clean and carrying the smell of things that only existed for an hour after rain and then were gone. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're always thinking," she said. "That gate on the south pasture," he said. "I need to rehang the whole thing, not just the hinge, probably 2 days of work." She looked at him. "That's what you're thinking about." "And the north fence has a section that's been worrying me since spring," he said. "And I should probably put up another room before winter if—" He stopped. She was watching him with an expression he was getting better at reading. "If," she said. He looked at the wet desert, at the stars coming back, at the porch, where the stick leaned dry against the post. "If you're staying," he said, quietly, directly, the only way he knew to say important things. The silence lasted long enough that he felt it. Then Evelyn said, "We're staying," and she said it in the same plain, direct way, like a fact being confirmed rather than a decision being announced, because somewhere between the courtroom and the root cellar and the eggs made the right way and the rain coming in from the west, it had stopped being a question and become the ground they were standing on. He nodded. She looked at the night. He looked at the night. And the ranch that had been quiet for 8 years held the two of them in its particular silence, which was not the silence of emptiness anymore, but the silence of a place that had what it needed and knew it. And the desert beyond the gate stretched out enormous and indifferent under the returning stars. And none of that indifference touched them, because indifference is only a problem when you're facing it alone. They weren't alone. That was the whole of it, not a grand conclusion, not a lesson delivered from above. Just the simple, hard-won, ordinary fact of it, that a broken stick found in a dry wash could be the beginning of something. That the people who showed up when you were at your worst sometimes turned out to be the people who stayed. That a family was not a thing you were assigned by blood or granted by a court, but a thing you built in the daily, imperfect, unremarkable work of choosing each other over and over again, in the small decisions that nobody witnessed and nobody recorded, but that accumulated, over time, into something that held. The gate on the south pasture still hung crooked. The north fence still had its worrying section. There was a room that needed building before winter, and a legal file in Tucson that still had Halstead's name on it, and 2 people on a porch steps who were still finding the edges of what they were to each other. None of it was finished. Most of it was barely started. But the rain had come and gone, and the stars were back, and Clara was asleep inside with her quilt pulled up and her stick on the porch where she'd find it in the morning, and that was enough to go on. That was more than enough.